The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the quiet streets of Oakdale. It was the kind of evening that made you believe the world was at peace, that injustices were tales told in history books, far removed from the present day. But as with many things, appearances can be deceiving. Officer John Mitchell cruised down Maple Street, his patrol car's tires humming against the asphalt. Known among his peers for his strict adherence to the rules, he prided himself on maintaining order in a town he believed had become too lenient. His eyes scanned the sidewalks, the alleys, always vigilant, always searching for signs of trouble. That's when he saw her. Dr. Kimberly Washington walked briskly, her heels clicking against the pavement, a stack of files clutched in her arms. Her expression was focused, determined, as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. And in many ways it did. As the newly appointed head of internal affairs for the Oakdale Police Department, she was tasked with ensuring accountability, transparency, and justice within the very force Officer Mitchell served. Unbeknownst to Mitchell, this was no ordinary evening, and Dr. Washington was no ordinary civilian. The encounter began innocuously enough. Mitchell pulled up alongside Dr. Washington, rolling down his window. "Evening, ma'am," he greeted, his tone professional yet tinged with an unspoken authority. "Good evening, officer," Dr. Washington replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the fatigue she felt from a long day's work. "Everything all right? You seem preoccupied," Mitchell observed, his gaze lingering on the files she held. "Just heading home after a long day at the office," she explained, offering a polite smile. "Long day at the office?" Mitchell echoed, his curiosity piqued. "What exactly does someone in your position do?" Dr. Washington's smile faded slightly, but she maintained composure. "I oversee internal investigations, ensuring that our officers uphold the highest standards of conduct." "Internal investigations?" Mitchell chuckled, a hint of skepticism in his laugh. "Sounds like a thankless job." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but it's necessary." There was a brief pause, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Mitchell's gaze hardened, his next words laced with subtle accusation. "You know, I've heard things about your department," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Rumors about corruption, about officers getting away with things." Dr. Washington met his gaze evenly. "Rumors can be misleading." "Maybe," Mitchell shrugged, "but I've seen things, heard things. Things that make you question where the real justice lies." The tension escalated, the casual exchange morphing into a subtle power struggle. Dr. Washington's grip tightened on her files, her knuckles whitening. "Is there a point to this conversation, officer?" she asked, her voice cool. Mitchell leaned back in his seat, his eyes never leaving hers. "Just wondering how deep this rabbit hole goes. How far does the corruption reach?" Dr. Washington took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I suggest you direct your concerns through the proper channels." Mitchell's lips curled into a smirk. "Oh, I intend to. But sometimes, it's the people on the inside who need to be watched the most." With that, he drove off, leaving Dr. Washington standing on the sidewalk, her heart pounding in her chest. She watched his taillights disappear into the distance, a sense of unease settling over her. Little did she know, this seemingly trivial encounter was the spark that would ignite a series of events, challenging the very foundation of the Oakdale Police Department and forcing everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about power, prejudice, and accountability. As the days passed, the incident lingered in the back of Officer Mitchell's mind. The encounter with Dr. Kimberly Washington had been unsettling, not because of her response but because of what he had learned, who she was. He couldn't shake the feeling of the control she had shown, the calm in her demeanor. It wasn't until later, when he casually overheard a conversation in the station, that the full weight of his actions hit him like a freight train. "Did you hear?" a fellow officer, Martinez, asked, leaning over the counter. "The new head of internal affairs is a woman. And get this, Dr. Kimberly Washington. They say she's no joke." Mitchell froze. His grip on the coffee mug tightened, his mind replaying the interaction with her. The files, the way she had carried herself, everything now made sense. Internal affairs. This woman was no mere civilian. She was the one tasked with keeping their department in check. She was the one with the power to expose any wrongdoing. His heart began to race as realization hit him. He had slapped the woman in charge of investigating police misconduct. Worse, he had done it without knowing who she was. "Kimberly Washington?" he asked, his voice coming out sharper than he intended. "Yeah, that's the one. She's been cleaning house for the last couple of weeks. A lot of officers are worried, to be honest," Martinez continued, his tone laced with uncertainty. Some of us are thinking she might be too aggressive. Like she's out for blood." Mitchell turned, staring blankly at the wall. Aggressive? She hadn't seemed aggressive, just composed, controlled. But he wasn't thinking clearly back then. He had been so quick to judge her, to dismiss her as just another civilian, unaware of her true identity and the immense power she held. The way he had treated her now seemed reckless, almost foolish. The more Mitchell thought about it, the more the weight of his actions grew. In that moment, standing in the kitchen with the other officers, he realized he hadn't just slapped a woman. He had slapped someone who could very well be the reason his career, his entire future, came crashing down. He had disrespected someone who held the key to exposing everything that could go wrong within the department. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a ticking time bomb. Dr. Washington, meanwhile, had no intention of letting the incident slide. The slap hadn't been the worst part, at least not in her eyes. It wasn't the physical pain or the indignity of it all that bothered her. It was the audacity, the arrogance, the unchecked behavior of an officer who believed he could get away with anything. That, more than anything, disgusted her. She had dealt with officers like Mitchell before, people who saw their badge as a shield to do whatever they pleased, to treat others as less than human. It was this toxic mentality that had driven her to take on the role of internal affairs in the first place. As she walked through the doors of the police station the following morning, she felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She had spent years fighting for justice, but today the fight felt personal. Dr. Washington didn't just want to reform a broken system. She wanted to shatter it and build something better in its place. But that wasn't going to be easy. The department was riddled with officers who saw themselves as untouchable. People like Mitchell were the reason she was here. And now she would have to confront them. Her office was quiet as she sat down, looking at the files stacked neatly on her desk. But her mind was elsewhere, on Mitchell. On that slap. On what he had done to her, to the system. The thought of him going unchecked, of him walking away from this without consequence, gnawed at her. She couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not ever. Minutes later, she picked up the phone and dialed a number she knew would send ripples through the department. This wasn't just about one officer's misstep. This was about sending a message. "Hello, Chief Carter." Dr. Washington's voice was calm but firm as she spoke. "I need you to gather the board. We have a situation." Mitchell wasn't aware of what was coming. He had gone through the motions that morning, trying to shake off the anxiety that had been building up since that conversation in the kitchen. But the truth was, it was all he could think about. The anger he had felt in that moment, the way he had raised his hand without a second thought, without any consideration for the consequences. It wasn't until he received a call from the chief's office that he began to understand how much trouble he was really in. "Mitchell, get down here. Now." Chief Carter's voice was clipped, professional, but there was a hint of urgency that Mitchell couldn't ignore. His stomach dropped. A few minutes later, he stood outside the chief's office, his palms sweaty. He knocked, a nervous tension in his step. "Come in," Carter's voice barked from inside. Mitchell pushed the door open, stepping into the room with a stiff posture. The chief was sitting behind his desk, looking uncharacteristically serious, his eyes narrowed. And standing next to him, arms crossed, was Dr. Kimberly Washington. Mitchell's heart skipped a beat. There she was, standing like a quiet storm, composed, her eyes steady as they locked onto his. "Mitchell," Carter began, his tone grave, "I'm sure you know why you're here." Mitchell swallowed hard, his throat dry. He nodded, barely able to make eye contact. "Yes, sir." Dr. Washington spoke next, her voice cold but unyielding. "Officer Mitchell, I've reviewed your actions during your interaction with me the other day. And I'm not pleased." Mitchell could feel his face flush with shame. He had never been reprimanded like this before, not by anyone. Certainly not by a civilian, and certainly not by someone as powerful as Dr. Washington. "You see," she continued, "your actions were not only unprofessional but dangerous. As an officer of the law, you're supposed to protect and serve, not harass and assault. Your behavior is exactly what I've been tasked with rooting out of this department." Mitchell opened his mouth, but no words came out. How could he explain himself? How could he justify his actions when deep down he knew there was no excuse? Dr. Washington stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "I don't know what you were thinking in that moment, but I can tell you now, your actions have consequences, Officer Mitchell. And you will be held accountable." A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He had known deep down that this was coming. He had hoped, foolishly, that it would all blow over, that she would be just another person in a long list of voices he could ignore. But he had misjudged her. He had underestimated her. And now the walls were closing in. As Dr. Washington turned to leave, her footsteps echoing down the hallway, Mitchell was left standing there, his mind racing, his chest tightening with fear. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. And now he would have to live with the consequences. Officer Mitchell sat in the waiting room, his hands trembling as he clutched the cold metal chair. Every sound seemed amplified in the sterile, dimly lit room, the hum of the air conditioning, the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. The walls that had once protected him, that had made him feel invincible, now felt like they were closing in on him. His mind raced with thoughts of what was to come, but there was one thought that kept repeating over and over again. How did I get here? The door to the office opened and Dr. Washington walked in. She was calm, composed, her steps deliberate as she approached the table where Mitchell sat. Her eyes met his, and in that moment, it felt like the world stood still. He couldn't escape her gaze. It was as though she could see right through him, past the badge, past the uniform, to the person he had tried so hard to bury. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she sat across from him, the space between them growing heavier with every passing second. Mitchell's heart pounded in his chest as he awaited her words, but none came. The silence was unbearable. Finally, Dr. Washington spoke, her voice steady but laced with authority. You know why you're here, Officer Mitchell? He nodded, his throat dry. The shame he felt was almost suffocating. He had never thought he would be in this position. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who did things by the book. But now the truth was clear. He had let the power of the badge blind him to the reality of his actions. He had crossed a line. And there was no going back. I'm sorry, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the only thing he could think to say, but even the words felt hollow. They did nothing to erase the hurt, the damage he had caused. Dr. Washington didn't respond immediately. Instead, she opened the folder in front of her, her fingers flipping through the papers with practiced precision. Mitchell couldn't help but feel as though each page she turned was another strike against him. His entire life, his career, was now laid bare for her to dissect. You're sorry, Dr. Washington finally said, her voice sharp, but sorry doesn't fix anything, does it? Sorry doesn't undo the harm you've caused, doesn't erase the fear and humiliation you put that woman through. Sorry doesn't bring justice to those you've sworn to protect. Sorry doesn't bring accountability. Mitchell flinched, the words cutting deeper than he had expected. He had heard apologies before, he had given them himself, but Dr. Washington's tone made him realize something he had been unwilling to face. Apologizing wasn't enough. Not anymore. I made a mistake, Mitchell tried again, his hands clenched into fists on the table. I didn't know who she was. You didn't know who she was? Dr. Washington interrupted, her voice rising ever so slightly. Does that make your actions any less wrong? Does that justify what you did to her? You didn't know who she was, but you still saw her as something less. You treated her like an enemy, like someone beneath you. Does that sound like a mistake to you, Officer Mitchell? He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on him. She was right. It wasn't about not knowing her name or her position. It was about the way he had treated her. The way he had assumed she was nothing more than someone to dismiss, someone to belittle. It wasn't a mistake. It was an act of prejudice, of bias that he had tried to justify in his own mind. She's the head of internal affairs, Mitchell said quietly, the realization sinking in. He had known this, of course. But now that the words were out in the open, they felt like a punch to the gut. I didn't know at the time. I didn't know who she was. And now you do, Dr. Washington replied, her voice cold. And that makes all the difference, doesn't it? Mitchell couldn't look her in the eye anymore. The weight of his guilt was crushing, and every second that passed in the room felt like 1,000 years. He wanted to apologize again, but he knew it would mean nothing. He could say he was sorry 1,000 times, but it wouldn't undo the harm he had caused. It wouldn't change the fact that he had acted out of racism, out of a sense of superiority that had no place in his profession. Dr. Washington continued, her gaze never leaving him. The question now is, what are you going to do about it, Officer Mitchell? Are you going to sit here and beg for forgiveness, or are you going to take responsibility for your actions? Are you going to own up to the fact that what you did was wrong, no matter who the person was? Or are you going to continue hiding behind excuses? The words stung, but they also pushed him to think about the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the trust that had been broken. It was about the damage he had caused not just to Dr. Washington, but to the department, to the community. He had tarnished the badge he wore, and no apology could change that. The only thing that could make this right, if anything could, was accountability. Mitchell took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The silence between them felt suffocating. He had spent his entire life running from the truth, from the things he didn't want to see, the things he didn't want to admit. But now there was no running. There was no avoiding it. He had to face it head-on. "I'll take responsibility," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll accept whatever consequences come my way. I know I don't deserve to wear this badge anymore, but I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Dr. Washington's expression softened for a brief moment, but the sternness never left her eyes. Taking responsibility is just the beginning. But it's a start. The room fell silent once more, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Mitchell felt a knot in his stomach. The road ahead would be difficult, painful, and uncertain. He had no idea what the next steps would be, or if he would even be able to stay on the force. But one thing was clear: this was a turning point. And there was no going back. As Dr. Washington stood up to leave, her footsteps echoing in the room, Mitchell remained seated, lost in thought. He had been given a chance to make things right, to prove that he was more than just a badge, more than just the mistakes he had made. But the real question was, could he? Would he be able to change, to rebuild the trust he had shattered? For the first time in a long time, Officer Mitchell wasn't sure of the answer. But as the door closed behind Dr. Washington, he knew one thing for certain. He was ready to find out. The following weeks passed in a blur of meetings, paperwork, and quiet conversations behind closed doors. Officer Mitchell had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, and the department seemed to be in a state of uneasy anticipation. Rumors swirled, whispered in corners of the station, between officers who had once been colleagues, now unsure of the path ahead. It was as if a shadow had fallen over everything, one that Mitchell could not escape no matter how hard he tried. For Dr. Kimberly Washington, the pressure weighed heavily, but it was different. She had walked into this role knowing what it would require, the responsibility that came with ensuring accountability in a system that was often reluctant to change. But now it felt personal. The slap, the incident, had been just one piece in a much larger puzzle. And that puzzle was far from being solved. Dr. Washington sat in her office late one night, the only light coming from the dim glow of a desk lamp. The stack of files before her seemed to grow every day, but she was determined to sift through each one, to ensure that no stone was left unturned. She knew the pressure would only intensify, especially now that Mitchell was facing public scrutiny. The entire department was watching, waiting for her next move. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she had been hesitant to call. "Chief Carter," her voice was calm, but there was a firmness beneath it. "We need to meet. Now." It wasn't long before Carter arrived at her office, his expression grim. The meeting between them wasn't just about the slap anymore, it was about something far more dangerous, something that threatened to undermine everything they had been working toward. Something that had been festering in the department for years. As soon as Carter sat down, Dr. Washington spoke, her voice low, filled with a sense of urgency. "I've been digging through the files and I've uncovered something troubling. Mitchell's actions were bad enough, but they weren't isolated. I found reports, patterns of behavior going back years. Officers abusing their power, manipulating situations, covering up misconduct. This isn't just one bad apple. It's systemic." Carter's face turned ashen. He had suspected something like this was going on, but seeing the evidence laid out before him hit harder than he could have imagined. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. What do we do about it? What's our next step? Dr. Washington's eyes narrowed. We expose it. We expose everything, Carter. No more covering up. No more looking the other way. If this department is ever going to change, we have to root out the corruption. We start with Mitchell, but we don't stop there. The chief nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of her words. This wasn't just a few isolated cases anymore. It was a systemic issue that had been allowed to persist, hidden under layers of secrecy and denial. And now, with Dr. Washington at the helm, it was all coming to light. Are you sure about this? Carter asked, his voice tinged with doubt. If we go public, if we start this investigation, we're not just challenging Mitchell. We're challenging everything. The entire department will be shaken to its core. Dr. Washington's gaze remained steady. It needs to be shaken. It has to be. This is bigger than us. This is about the community we're supposed to serve. This is about the people who trust us to protect them. The weight of those words lingered in the air as Carter silently processed them. 4 years, the department had been a well-oiled machine, each officer playing their part, each one adhering to the unspoken rules of loyalty and protection. But those rules were broken now. Trust had been violated, and the damage was far-reaching. The road ahead would be difficult, messy, and uncomfortable, but Dr. Washington was resolved. She had made up her mind and she wasn't backing down. The next morning, the department was thrown into chaos. A public statement was released, one that was unlike anything the department had ever issued before. It detailed the internal investigation that had uncovered multiple instances of misconduct within the ranks, including the behavior of Officer Mitchell. But it didn't stop there. The statement went further, acknowledging the systemic issues that had been allowed to fester and vowing to address them head-on. The reaction was immediate. The public was stunned, and the media jumped on the story with a ferocity that left the department scrambling. The community was divided, some expressing shock and disappointment, others cheering for the bold step toward accountability. It felt as though the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Within the department, the atmosphere shifted. Officers who had once been allies now found themselves looking at each other with suspicion. Mitchell's case was only the beginning. As the investigation into the department's practices unfolded, more officers were implicated, some with years of service, some recent recruits. It was clear that no one, regardless of rank or tenure, was safe from scrutiny. Mitchell, who had been temporarily suspended, was now facing the full force of the investigation. The slap, his unprovoked assault on Dr. Washington, had been the catalyst, but it was the other revelations, the systemic corruption, the cover-ups, the unethical behavior, that would define his fate. He had once believed that his actions could go unnoticed, that he could escape the consequences of his behavior. But now there was no hiding. There was no more room for excuses. As Mitchell sat in the small room, waiting for the disciplinary hearing to begin, he couldn't help but reflect on the choices that had brought him to this point. The arrogance, the sense of invincibility he had felt as a cop, as someone above reproach. It had all led to this moment. He was no longer just a figure in uniform, he was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. He had crossed the line and there was no going back. The doors opened and Dr. Washington entered, her presence commanding the room. Mitchell could feel the tension in his chest tighten. He had seen her before in meetings in the background of the station, but now she was standing in front of him, her role as head of internal affairs more real than ever. Her gaze was sharp, unwavering as she took a seat. "Officer Mitchell," she began, her voice steady, "today is the beginning of the rest of your life. What happens here today will determine your future, whether you remain in law enforcement or whether you face the consequences of your actions." Mitchell nodded silently, his mouth dry. He had no defense. He had no excuse. He had put himself in this position, and now he would have to face the music. The proceedings were formal, but the weight of the moment was undeniable. As each officer was called to testify, as each piece of evidence was presented, the true scale of the corruption within the department came into focus. Mitchell, who had once seen himself as part of the solution, was now just another cog in the broken machine. He had allowed himself to become a part of the very system he had once sworn to protect. But even as he sat there, knowing that his career was likely over, a small part of him felt a glimmer of hope. Dr. Washington had made it clear that accountability was the only path forward, and while he didn't expect mercy, he knew that her leadership was the change the department needed. This was a reckoning and it was long overdue. As the hearing progressed, Mitchell realized that this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been affected by the culture of corruption, the community that had been left behind by those sworn to protect it. The real work was just beginning, but there was no turning back now. The system was being dismantled, piece by piece, and Dr. Washington was leading the charge. In the end, it wasn't just about one officer's mistakes. It was about changing a system that had allowed those mistakes to happen in the first place. Mitchell's fate would be determined by the actions of those who had the courage to confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. And for the first time in a long time, Mitchell understood what true justice meant.